Most of you have likely gone under the knife at some point, and I bet all of you have heard a surgery story from a friend or family member. Now picture this. You are thrown back in time by a few thousand years. This time you are seated on a wooden chair or lying on a stone table, with not a single piece of tech inside to assist the surgeon. It's just them and their basic tools. And forget about those intense surgical lights they have in modern hospitals. You are at the mercy of natural daylight. Just imagining this might make you say, no, okay, thanks, I live with my issue. And who could blame you? But believe it or not, ancient surgery was pretty advanced, successfully tackling issues like cataracts and saving patients from parasites that are nearly forgotten today. How did they pull off such delicate operations, and how long has the role of surgeon actually existed? Hang tight, we are about to dive into all of that. Welcome to Chronobit, I am Rogerio, and this is the story of the origins of modern surgery. Before we get into the juicy details of how high-risk surgeries were performed in ancient times, let's take a moment to understand when humans started cutting into one another to heal. As you might guess, this practice is ancient, but just how ancient? Consider this: archaeological discoveries have shown that as far back as the Stone Age, surgeries were performed to amputate limbs for health reasons. And yes, even then, a rudimentary understanding of anatomy was essential. All this knowledge was passed down orally from person to person, making it impossible to learn indirectly. That's why there was a need for a way to compile the insights of multiple doctors and make it accessible to anyone. Well, at least to anyone who could read back then. I'm talking about writing, but not just any kind of writing. We're not talking about a rough draft of words here, but rather full-fledged text with a scientific approach, capable of clearly guiding someone through a medical procedure. The Egyptians were the pioneers in this endeavor. We know this because of the discovery of a papyrus known as the Edwin Smith Papyrus, named after the person who found it. This ancient document is a treasure trove of surgical operation descriptions for stitching up wounds. It's fascinating for a couple of main reasons. The first is its writing style, which closely mirrors the scientific approaches we use today. The second is its age, dating back to 1700s BC, which places it nearly 4,000 years in the past. The archaic language used suggests it might just be a copy of an even older manuscript, possibly written a millennium earlier. Sure, the Egyptians were definitely some of the first to jot down medical knowledge in ancient times, but they weren't the only ones in the game. Another civilization gradually made its mark in the ancient world in this area, a civilization that's still renowned today for many aspects of its culture and organization, including advancements in law, the arts, and science. Medicine included, of course. And that's Rome we are talking about, both in its Republic and Empire days. And of course, Rome absorbed all the wisdom of the Greeks, who were, needless to say, pretty advanced in this field themselves. But it was during the Roman Empire that real medical treatises began to be written, like the Medicina by the Roman physician Celsus. This work didn't just cover the basics like amputations, stitches, and broken bones. It delved into delicate matters like eye surgery, because, believe it or not, even back in the day, eye conditions were a thing. Probably even more so given the dusty and earthy living conditions they endured. Roman citizens, in particular, were wrestling with trichiasis, a condition that makes eyelashes grow the wrong way, that is, inward toward the eyeball, causing irritation, pain, and inflammation. So what did the Roman docs do? They'd flip the eyelids inside out, pluck out the lashes with tools like scissors or tweezers, and then sear the hair roots with a red-hot needle to keep them from coming back. Otherwise, the problem would just keep coming back. Sure, hearing about it makes it sound like a risky business. I mean, just thinking about a red-hot needle near my eyes gives me the heebie-jeebies. But for a Roman doc, this was pretty much child's play. Cataracts, however, were a whole different story. They were a leading cause of blindness, just like they are today. And just like today, back then they could perform surgery to try to save patients' sight. But obviously, such a procedure was no walk in the park. Celsus give us the lowdown on how they prepared for this kind of operation.
The patient needs to be seated across from the surgeon in a well-lit room, facing the light, while the surgeon sits on a slightly higher stool. An assistant holds the patient's head from behind to keep it still, because even the slightest movement could permanently damage their sight. To keep the eye being treated as still as possible, they had covered the other eye with wool and secure it with a bandage. Moreover, the left eye should be operated on with the right hand and the right eye with the left hand.
You've got to admit, the innovation level of the Roman civilization was off the charts, not just in general, but in the medical field too. Imagine this: during some digs, they unearthed a copper case containing 3 super thin needles with handles and a couple of needle syringes. Basically, these were ultra-thin retractable needles slid into really slim tubes. This find confirmed a procedure described by another Roman doc, Galeno, who talked about cataract removal as a pretty mind-blowing operation. They thread the needle through the eyeball to break up the cataract and then use a small tube to suck out the debris and clear the lens. It was definitely an effective procedure, but just as you are picturing it, it was super risky, even for a seasoned doctor. And that's exactly why Celsus suggested an alternative method for tackling cataracts. He'd use a regular bronze needle to shift the lens with the cataract to another part of the eye. What's really cool is that this same technique is still used today, and as long as there's no infection, it can completely restore someone's vision. The Romans weren't the first to perform eye surgeries on their patients. There was another group skilled in this area, a civilization much older than the Greco-Roman one, namely the Babylonians, who lived in what is now Iraq. These folks from Mesopotamia, often painted in a negative light in the Bible as symbols of corruption and sins, were actually way ahead of their time in the field of surgery, including eye operations. Unfortunately, we don't have detailed written records like those of the Romans, but this practice is mentioned in the famous Code of Hammurabi, the first legal code in history compiled by King Hammurabi in the 18th century BC. And this is something we could dive into in another video, so let me know if you are interested by dropping a comment below. But coming back to the topic, according to this document, if a doctor performed a major operation in a noble with a bronze lancet and saved his sight, or if he opened the orbit of a noble with a bronze lancet and saved the eye, he would receive 10 shekels of silver. The code also mentions the compensation for operations on a common citizen, which was 5 shekels, or 2 shekels for a slave. So it's pretty clear that these operations were common back then. People were practical in those days, not everyone could read, and even fewer could write. So they wouldn't bother to include something in the code that was rare occurrence, you know? But it wasn't all sunshine and roses, because performing eye surgeries in ancient Babylon was no walk in the park. If a doctor messed up an operation on noble and caused them to lose their sight, the punishment according to Hammurabi's code was severe, as such a mistake cost a surgeon a hand. In other words, operating on a noble was risky business for both parties. But Babylonians and Romans also shared another kind of procedure in common, an even more extreme one: operations on human skull. But how were these delicate operations carried out? Well, in the tomb of a Roman surgeon, they found a bronze trepanation kit used to remove a circular section of the skull. The drill bit, shaped like a tube, had a removable guide to help with the initial stages of the operation, a bow to drive it, and a cap to protect the surgeon's hand. Believe it or not, some medical manuals from the time emphasized that the drills needed to be frequently dipped in the cold water to prevent overheating from the friction between the drill bit and the bone. Now, I'm not trying to say that Babylonians and Romans were the only ones to engage in this kind of surgery. There were others, for sure. But the burning question now is, why were they done? What were they trying to treat with brain surgery? This question might seem so basic it's almost silly, but the reason is anything but trivial, especially for today's standards. The first to grasp how ahead of their time the ancients were in terms of surgery, to the point of performing actual brain operations, was Paul Broca in Paris. And if any of you are French, forgive my pronunciation. Broca was a leading figure in the late 18th century in the fields of surgery, anatomy, and anthropology. And that's precisely why a skull discovered in 1865, dating back to the Stone Age and missing a piece of the cranium, was brought to him. Historians of the time immediately assumed it belonged to an unfortunate victim of a violent death, whose skull was pierced by some primitive man to drink from it as if it were a cup. Clearly, they didn't hold their ancestors in high regard. However, Broca made a discovery that led to a completely different conclusion. The skull was indeed pierced, but not for some gruesome, macabre reason, but because it had been surgically operated on. The edges of the hole in the skull he examined showed signs of bone tissue regrowth, which clearly, beyond a doubt, indicated that the patient had survived the operation. This was a staggering conclusion, especially for folks in the 18th centuries, a time when brain surgery was still largely theoretical in the medical field, and the mortality rate was high. Of course, this is just one of many cases of operated skulls found. I won't list them all here, or this video will go on forever and lose its focus. But if you are curious to learn about more, the internet will surely be able to help you out. The real kicker now is figuring out if these folks were getting head surgery. Turns out, skull operations were pretty common among soldiers who had taken a hit to the head in the battle, to prevent bone shards from messing with the brain. And there's a bunch of clues backing up this theory. A lot of the skulls that were dug up and had undergone this kind of surgery belonged to men. Plus, most of them had the surgery on the left side of the head. And if you're thinking about it, since most of the world's population is right-handed, in a fight, the hand holding the weapon would mainly be the right one. So, if a blow lands on the enemy's head, which side of the skull is gonna face the brunt? Well, definitely the left. There were other reasons to go under the knife to skull surgery, like the hydrocephalus, which the Romans talked about. But some historical accounts hint a totally different and much more chilling reason. According to some medieval Chinese tales, there were folks from Tachin, what's now Syria, who were skilled in the art of removing weird bugs from people's head to cure blindness. Yep, you heard that right. Pulling bags out of the people's heads. Surgeons from Arabia were particularly famed for this kind of procedure, and this practice is also mentioned in ancient Indian tradition. It's said that in Taxila, an area now known as Pakistan, the king of doctors taught how to crack open people's skull to extract dangerous worms from the brain. But that's not all. There's a widely told legend about a student of the king of doctors, a guy named Jivaka. This student went on to become the personal physician of the Buddha. But the part of his history that grabs our attention involves a legend. According to the stories, Jivaka had a magic gem that could pinpoint the source of diseases. Now, you can choose to believe in this legend enough to go on a wild goose chase for the gem or dismiss it as an exaggeration, but that's beside the point. The key takeaway is that with this gem, Jivaka supposedly located a centipede inside a man's head, and by opening the skull, he managed to remove the bag using heated tweezers. And thanks to this operation, the patient actually recovered. Now, if this were just a tale from an ancient civilization, we might write it off as a pure fiction. But when multiple cultures from different parts of the globe share similar stories, there might just be a grain of truth in there. So how should we interpret these tales of worms, centipedes, and various other bugs being pulled out of people's brains? The answer might come from man's best friend, the dog. This animal can get infected by a parasite known as the dog tapeworm. This parasite can make its way into the dog through sheep. For instance, the larva can form cysts in a sheep's liver, which then, if eaten by a dog, grows inside the new hosts and turn into a massive tapeworm. Unfortunately, the larvae don't just stick to the liver, they can also make their way to the ship's brain, causing it to struggle around with an unstable gait as if it were drunk. And this condition is known as coenurosis, and back in ancient Eastern Europe, farmers would treat this ailment by scraping the unfortunate creature's skull with an iron knife to locate and remove the larva. As you can imagine, unfortunately not many animals could survive such a procedure, but thankfully today various treatments have been developed to rid farm dogs of these worms, significantly reducing the prevalence of this dreadful disease. But the burning question we are really interested in right now is, could these larvae also infect the humans in addition to sheep? The chilling answer, unfortunately, is yes. In fact, it was probably a fairly common condition among prehistoric farmers who were in constant close contact with their animals. It's even been speculated that the humans were the original hosts before domesticating sheep, which then became the preferred hosts for these tapeworms before they reached dogs. It's worth nothing, though, that while the cysts caused by this parasite in the brain can be large, the parasite itself is not visible to the naked eye. So there's likely a bit of embellishment in those ancient stories. However, it's also true that recently in Australia, a worm that was still alive was removed from a woman's brain. So maybe those tales weren't entirely made up after all. At this point, a question naturally arises. How could people endure the pain while undergoing these kinds of operations? Were they just way tougher than we are today, or had they already discovered some form of anesthesia? Well, that's a topic for another video, so stay tuned to Chronobit by subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell icon so you won't miss any upcoming content. Thanks for watching, and if you want to support the channel, drop a big like because it makes a huge difference for us. See you in the next video.